we need to push ourselves, but we need to be open to God as that wind filling our sails. It will happen. God is waiting for us to step into that sunlight.
Be strong in your courage when others despair.
Well, grace, self-effort. There was once a man who died and went to heaven. And of course, he met St. Peter at the pearly gates. And Peter said, here's how it works. You need 100 points to get to heaven. And the man, he says, you tell me all the good things that you've done, and we'll see if you get in. And the man's like, oh, God, I got this. Well, first of all, I married a woman, and we stayed together for 50 years. That's got to be worth something. And I was faithful, even in my heart. And he said, that's wonderful. That's worth 3 points. And the man's like, searching his pockets now for other things that he did. Well, I attended church all my life, and I was active in the ministry, and I tithed even. It's like, well, that's worth certainly a point. It's like, oh, gosh. And he said, well, what about the time I started that soup kitchen in the inner city, and we fed all these people and homeless veterans? And he said, well, that is at least 2 points. And the man said, 2 points? At this rate, I'm not going to get into heaven without God's grace. And he said, exactly, son, come on in. And this, the underlying, I found this, of course, on a mainline church joke site. They have a lot of those if you go out there on the internet. It's like a whole section of the internet. And, in more dogmatic understandings of religion, churchianities, that's what is preached. There's even a type of Buddhism that preaches that if you pray to the Buddha, he will incarnate you later into an ideal Buddha land. And I'm sure people actually do it. I'm not trying to discriminate, but you can see where this goes. An ideal place where you can meditate later, where nobody's going to disturb you, there's no barking dogs or children, and you don't get hungry. And it's like our version of heaven, like if we just believe something, we'll get there. And then you see that too in some of the New Age traditions where if you wish it, it'll just happen, And then even a little deeper, there is Jnana Yoga, or the path of wisdom and self-inquiry, is something that really got me onto the path. And it's still something that I hold dear, but there are those in the Jnana tradition who also, and it's true, they abide as the self, as they are, and they eschew any technique, any real discipline. And sure enough, I've tried that for years, where I will be the self, and I'll watch what's coming up, And then I watch as, oh, I'm feeling tired. Oh, just watch it. Oh, I'm falling asleep. Oh, just watch it, And you're not the self-honesty isn't there. There is self-effort that we need on this spiritual path, and we can see that just out of common sense, When I first, 12 years ago, let's go back in time. Raise your hand if you're the same person you were 12 years ago. We put out the energy to get to where we are. 12 years ago, it was amazing. You know that grace is everywhere. You know that God is everywhere. We're taught that everything is Divine Mother. The cops and the robbers, everything. It's all a manifestation of her consciousness. And yet, why don't we feel it? Why don't we see it? Swami Kriyananda had that example, which has been used many times, which is that grace is like the sun shining, but you can't experience it unless you open up the curtains. And that sounds fairly easy to do. Okay, let's open the curtains. But in my life 12 years ago, I was in an apartment, mentally speaking, that was so full of junk, I couldn't even get to the curtains. There was a lot to do, a lot of self-effort to do, a lot of purification, that I could even get to the point where I could be receptive to grace. You name it. We've all been through adolescence, either physically or maybe we still are spiritually in our adolescence. And one thing after another, I really had to put out energy. I remember I used to be a smoker. And at that point in my life, I must have been 16 or something like that. But then, luckily, I had this grace of a little bit of awakening. My first one, I'll share with you this story. I was up on a mountain doing things I shouldn't have done with friends who I shouldn't have been with. And I remember in this altered state of consciousness that I was in, I remember looking at this tree. And I thought, well, I'm going to go walk over to that tree. And then for the first time in my life, I asked, why? And I realized my whole life, all the things that I had done were just from desire nature. And in that moment, it shattered everything. It sounds so mundane. But I said, why do I want to go walk over to that tree? And the answer was, the answer was, it's because I'm unhappy. And I thought, no, that can't be. But it was right there. It was that voice of God, that silent little, because you're unhappy. And I said, it will explain that. I said, well, you're not content with where you are. All your action up to this point has been to fix something, fix that lack of content. And you think by doing all these things. So then I said, well, I'm going to sit down then. And I'm not going to do anything that it tells me to do. I started to first have that discrimination, that viveka of who is this little voice that's ordering me around and telling me to do things, understanding that ego side. So I sit there and I think, well, maybe I just don't do anything and maybe I'll be free. And then sure enough, I start to realize, this is before I read the Bhagavad Gita, where there's Krishna's whole exhortation to Arjuna is, you can't just sit there, you have to do something. And so I sat there, and then I realized, oh, I'm getting hungry. Oh, my back hurts. Oh, this, oh, that. And not only that, but, oh, I don't want to get up. And I thought, oh my goodness. Here I am not wanting to go be in restless activity. Now I'm getting attached to non-activity. You see, now it's not acting because I don't want to act, or don't act because that's what my ego is telling me. You can't, in that duality, you can't be guided by inaction. You have to choose. You have to make choices. You're a human being in a human body. And then I thought about all the great masters. It just started coming into my mind. And I thought, wow, Jesus, he was a busy guy. He was going out there and speaking to people, and he had to earn his living somehow, and master touring all over the place. Self-effort is definitely needed. I've got a little, going back to the mainline Christian thing, Master Yogananda, whose teachings we follow, he has a great quote from Essence of Self-Realization. He says, every religious group I've encountered in this country tells its members they don't have to work for their salvation. Lest any man should boast, is the quote. They explain, quoting St. Paul, that their doctrine of salvation is based entirely on belief. Believe as they do, and you'll be saved by God's grace. Many make church membership a further condition for salvation, the implication being that if anything more needs doing, the church will do it for you. And he says, suppose you want riches. Will you sit in a room and wait for God to give them to you simply because you believe in him? Hardly. You'll work very hard to earn them. Why then expect salvation to come to you effortlessly just because you believe? So this path, I remember, I don't remember who it was, but describing our path of Kriya Yoga, and any path with a technique of God realization, but specifically Kriya Yoga was described as the most effective tool for man's liberation by self-effort, by actually taking up the practice and putting it to the test, really. And so discipline is needed. Just like before I could open up the curtains and experience God's light, I needed to purify my mental apartment. But the intention was there. God helps us with that. I can't claim any credit for some of those early things falling away. But as soon as smoking, for instance, fell away, I thought, wow, you just feel the release of that energy. And the next thing, I had the same experience as Swami, where he was wanting to be a hermit, but he was a smoker. And he's like, well, who ever heard of a hermit with a smoking habit? I can't be out there. Like, you just see how that desire would take you back to the world to get your carton and then go back up the hill, And so we have a lot of work to do, mundane work to do initially on the spiritual life to get this body temple purified as first, If the body has these aches and pains, it's calling out to us to address and to purify it. And this path of yoga that we all practice, it's based off of self-effort. I mean, take Hatha yoga, for example. You've got this body that's screaming in pain. Well, you'd actually do something about it. You don't forget that it's there or wish it away. You actually get into the posture that releases it. And then you can take that energy up the spine again. And take our practice of God remembrance, of japa, chanting God's name throughout the day. The mind filled with negative self-talk and narratives that close us off from that light. Well, we replace it. We brush it away with the name of God. We brush it away with the feeling, I am loving awareness. We have these techniques, and we have to put out the effort to it. There's a story from the autobiography of a yogi, of advanced disciple of Lahiri Mahashai, Swami Pranabhananda. And you see when you tune into the lives of the saints, where that purification takes them, and it takes them, and they do put out tremendous discipline. Pranabhananda got Kriya from Lahiri and started meditating, and he would work all day in the office, and then he would meditate for a number of years, 8 hours a night. And here are these, very high souls already, but they're still doing their sadhana, and they're doing it as hard as they can. And then finally, he gets to this point, after years, where he comes to Lahiri and he says, I've been trying so hard with my will, to do this, to stay in the God remembrance, to do the Kriya, but there's still this veil. How do I get past that? I know you can help me because you're God in human form to me. You're my guru. And he says, and he touches him on the heart and he says, okay, you go meditate and you should be taken care of. And sure enough, he gets that final mile. He goes all the way to God. And he said famously that now I enjoy the spiritual pension all the time, whether I'm awake or asleep. So it's this marriage that we have of self-effort, of applying ourselves. But then we can't, like as Swami says, we can't develop this hyper spiritual ego that's, I'm going to get to God if it's the last thing I do, We cut off the flow in that. There has to be this marriage of our own effort and yet openness. And really, you see that in Hatha yoga, where there's always a part of the body that's tense, right? That's holding the body up so that the other part can relax. And that's what we have. Yoga, it's a stretch. That's what I always say. Yoga is a stretch because it's calling us to cultivate a strong ego, that ignition that Swami says, that effort, those disciplines, in order that we can let them go when Divine Mother really comes to us. And then we realize it's her grace that will take us all the way. It's not by any effort that we have on our own. But we have to purify and get to that place. We have to open the window. So there's another little story I wanted to share here. It's of, I've been reading, as you maybe remember a couple weeks ago, I've been reading this book on Dr. Lewis, who was one of Master's first disciples in the West. And this was the first time he ever meditated. And he took Master out to the North Shore of Massachusetts in the winter. And Master wanted to get by the water, and so they got out on this breakwater, these big, sharp, jaggedy boulders. And he says, Doctor, this is a good place for us to sit and contemplate. And of course, the doctor's like, okay. He had just had this experience of seeing the spiritual eye and having his heart blown open by Master, but he'd never really done meditation. That's amazing to think about. So he goes out there on the breakwater and he said, on the hour, excruciating pain, on the hour, his bottom on the sharp rocks, his knees, but then he kept looking over at Master and saying, well, if he can do it, I surely can. There's that self-effort. Well, if he can do it, I surely can. And then another hour goes by. Oh my gosh, look at him. He's in bliss. Well, if he can do it, surely I can. Finally, he says, by the grace of God, my legs went numb Everything went numb. I guess that's maybe the first step to leaving body consciousness. He pushed himself, and he said, and then it was like time slipped away, and he felt Master shaking him. Doctor, we have to get out of here. What? And the water was coming up, breaking up over the breakwater. And he said, but I pushed myself. And since then, I never had trouble with meditation. I never was disturbed. I always was able to do it. And then later on in his life, he had his hermitage out in the Borrego Desert. And people would say, gosh, how was it? It was 100 in LA. What was it there, 115? And he had all the windows closed, big heavy curtains. I mean, it was baking in there. And he says, oh, it was just fine. He was truly, he had perfected that, escaping that body consciousness. And so these saints, they hold to us what can be accomplished if we just push ourselves just a little bit more, One of the things that we recommend here is to take a seclusion. And initially, that can be just one day, out of a month, where you schedule it just for God, and you push yourself just a little bit more. And or doing a longer meditation. In the winter, we have this really blessed thing that Master started years ago called the 8-hour meditation. It's right around Christmas. And I wanted to tell another story to just juice you up for applying ourselves spiritually. Master had another direct disciple, Yogacharya Oliver Black, who was a businessman from Michigan, and he didn't always come out to see Master as much as Master would have liked him to. But on one of these times, he came out finally to one of these 8-hour meditations, and he was a little late. And so he thought, I'll just sneak into the back, And as he gets in there, he sees that Master's up on the dais, and Rajasi is there, St. Lin, and there's an empty spot on the dais. And he's like, oh, I wonder who that's for. And so he slips into the back, and Master opens his eyes and goes, right here. And he's like, oh no, and I have to sit on the floor, And so he gets down there, and it's the same thing with Dr. Lewis. It's really amazing. On the hour, he's trying to get up. Master holds his leg down. Oh gosh, And then 45 minutes elapse, and maybe I can slip away, Master holds him down. This goes on for 4 hours, and he's just desperate, He's trying to apply himself, use that self-effort, but something more is needed, isn't it? And the last time he tries to get up, the Master pushes him down with great force, and then his spine just goes into alignment, and he leaves body consciousness. He just soars into that first state of samadhi, and the next 4 hours go by, like that. And so we need to push ourselves, but we need to be open to God as that wind filling our sails. It will happen. God is waiting for us to step into that sunlight. But unless we develop that, some of those qualities of willingness and determination, we're not able to even get to that level of consciousness. I remember one saint saying that it's the suffering and it's the challenges and the trials in our lives that fire us, almost like plunging steel into the furnace, that make us strong so that we can actually experience that higher consciousness. I remember, all the names escape me, but it must have been Sri Yukteswar telling, oh no, it was Master telling somebody, if I gave you cosmic consciousness, could you handle it? And, can we handle the annihilation of everything that we know and as being these little body minds separate from everything? Can we really handle that expansiveness of consciousness above, beyond, and all around? Unless we have these experiences of pushing ourselves, of stretching ourselves to accommodate that. And that's, eventually all this struggle will lead to that surrender, but we have to make ourselves ready. The temple of the body and the mind have to become pure to receive the Lord. And one of my favorite saints in India, Swami Ramdas, Papa Ramdas, somebody once asked him, is discipline necessary to get rid of the ego? And this is what he says, and this is a little further down the road for us. So, but it's very funny what he says. as well. He says, "You must feel, oh God, by myself I cannot do anything. I must progress by your strength and grace alone. To attain this state, though, discipline is necessary." It's that, and he says, "The ego is a terrible fellow. You have to give him a long rope and let him hang himself. Then he will say, I'm absolutely nothing. And then that little ego becomes humble, and in meekness and humility we find God. But that ego will not bend so easily. He pretends now that he's a very humble devotee. But inwardly he knows it is only pride aping humility. And this is the case with so many. But it's clear from the story of the two frogs in a pot of curds that you must churn, and make that butter, and then stop. The butter is formed, which will release you from that pot. You struggle for a while, and afterwards give up the struggle by utter surrender to the will of God. In that state of surrender, you get him, but not by merely struggling. Struggle is a sure condition of progress. And then the struggle ceases in surrender. But we can't surrender yet because we're not there, We can't surrender now because we'd be surrendering to the ego, wouldn't we? Until we develop that. And in our path, we use the technique. We use the technique of seva, of loving service, of our sadhana, of doing the technique. And as Ramakrishna said, in this dual path that we have here with I and thou, we use that ego is like a stick that prods the fire, that flames of devotion. And we need it. We need this healthy ego. We need this strength and self-effort to get to God. But when we get to him, we throw it in. We get rid of that stick. We don't need it anymore. But we can't throw it in yet. We need to develop ourselves, and we need to follow the example of the great ones. As Master would meditate all night as a child until he got that vision of Krishna, and his friend, I can't even stay awake anymore. And he says, "You sleep, I will die if needed to see my Lord Krishna." And then, of course, Krishna comes, and his friend says, "Oh, it's your imagination." And Master says, "Come here," hits him on the heart, and he sees Krishna too. And these, even the greatest of us, these great masters have to apply themselves with 100% effort. So that's our invitation, and God will give us the grace and sweep the deck for us to choose him ever more and more. We're not in this alone, for sure. As we walk down that road like the prodigal son, we find the Lord is running towards us as well, all the way. And in fact, going back to that, to what I feel like as Kriya Yogis is the practical application of Jnana Yoga in our path, remembering that this very self that is trying to awaken is God himself. It's only when this little self gets lost in all of these objects around us. But if we can practice the techniques with the remembrance that God is the doer, God is the one doing, God makes me do this sadhana. Without God's sustaining this body and without this breath, I couldn't meditate. I couldn't feed myself. It really is. It's God alone that is the one that's the power behind all of this. So that marriage of putting ourselves in the position to receive that grace is our invitation for today. I'm going to read this from Master's Whispers from Eternity. Demand for the realization of God's presence. O Divine Father, thou art just behind my prayer, but why dost thou seem so far away? Thou dost tremble through my feelings, and thy presence pushes through the veil of my thoughts. Yet thou seemest so far away. Come, Father, take away the veil. Come, Father, come. Listen to the voice of my prayer. I want to know thee. I want to talk to thee. I want to hear thee speak to me. I want to pray to thee and know that thou dost hear my prayer. Show me the way that leads to thee. Om. Peace. Amen. Keep calling him. Keep calling.